Yesterday, it was announced that the UK's rate of inflation had hit 10.1%. So what is inflation and how do we measure it? How do we get this number of 10.1%? I'm also going to be explaining to you how the BBC got this graph wrong. I actually thought today would be a slow news day. More for me. So inflation is the sustained rise in the price of goods and services in the economy. What that means is the price of all goods and services are going up in the economy. And this means that your money has less purchasing power. It buys you less stuff today than it did yesterday. But how do we know there's inflation? How do we measure it? Well, that's because there's a figure produced by the ONS, or the Office for National Statistics. And that figure is called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. Now, the CPI tracks inflation through what we call a basket of goods. What the ONS do is they compile a basket which contains goods that the average household buy. You can see on screen now the different sectors that they break those down into. So, for example, here we have some apples, we have a cereal box, some rice, some bread, and some tomatoes, but there's a whole range of other stuff in the CPI as well. What the ONS then do is they track the prices of this individual item. In practice, supermarkets will send them the current pricing of these items. Then by compiling them together, they can track how those prices change. And this is where we then get our 10.1%. What we're saying is the goods that are contained within this basket have inflated by 10.1% on average. Of course, inflation affects different goods differently. For example, the price of an apple may have gone up by 8%, while the price of bread may have gone up by 15%. That's actually kind of accurate because one of the big drivers of inflation is the price of grain. But what we want is a measure of the total. So we want to look at total inflation, not just for individual items. So what's important to remember is the ONS want this basket to be as representative of the average household as possible. So what they do is they add and take away items to the basket of goods to keep it relevant to today's society. For example, they took out men's suits and they added women's sports clothing. So why have they done that? Well, this is clearly in response to two things. The first is that it's more common for people to work from home, and that means they're dressing less formally. So there's less demand for suits, there's less people buying suits. So if suits were included, this basket wouldn't be indicative of the average household. Additionally, we've seen a rise of athleisure. This is a part of the clothing market where sportswear is worn for leisure. Antibacterial wipes have been added. I wonder why. Now, remember, there are some downfalls with the basket of goods, and that is the fact that it only represents the average household. And of course, a large minority of us don't conform to the average, like my spending habits are probably not the same as what's in the basket of goods. The basket also had a major issue in that it didn't include non-brand or own branded goods. It only included branded goods. The people most likely to buy those own brands are going to be those on lower income. So it's not a good way to record inflation, especially for those who are the most vulnerable to inflation. And this was a big campaign by Jack Monroe, was to get those own brands included in the basket of goods. So the ONS have started to do this now, but only very recently. We also have CPIH, and what that does is take the CPI's basket of goods and adds the cost of renting and housing to it. We also have RPI, which is the Retail Price Index, but that's not really used anymore because the methodology was a bit problematic. So the main benchmark measure is CPI. So with all of that in mind, can you think what might be wrong with this graph here? So what this is attempting to do is show changes of inflation over time. Of course, we have a huge peak back in 1973 because of the Yom Kippur crisis and the oil crisis that occurred because of that. And what this is kind of trying to demonstrate is how high inflation is today. But what do we know about the CPI and the basket of goods? Well, we change what's in the basket of goods. So inflation today isn't looking at the same goods that we were looking at, for example, in 1973. It is literally like comparing apples with pears.
If you'll pardon the pun.
And I suppose this graph does give us a bit more of an understanding about relative rates of inflation. But we have to be really careful because this can come across quite disingenuous because it's not truly a valid comparison we're making there because we've changed the stuff we're measuring. So to conclude then, these CPI figures are really, really important because they're what the government use to calculate policy and also to adjust things like pensions and benefits. Gotcha. And the headline is this: with Westminster disintegrating by the day, CPI is going up and up and up, while everyone's living standards go down and down and down.